Good evening, time traveler. Get comfortable, take a deep breath, and prepare for a journey into one of America's most mythologized eras. Tonight, we're going to experience what it was really like to live in Texas during the Wild West period, roughly 1865 to 1890. But forget the images of heroic cowboys riding into sunsets, honorable gunfighters settling disputes at high noon, and frontier justice bringing order to lawless lands. That's not our story tonight. Our journey takes us to Texas in the 1870s, the decade after the Civil War, when the cattle boom was at its height and the frontier was still being violently contested. This isn't the Hollywood version of noble ranchers building empires or brave lawmen taming wild towns. This is the reality. The brutal heat and drought that killed cattle by the thousands, the casual violence where disputes were settled with guns because law enforcement was scarce or corrupt, the back-breaking labor of cattle drives where you ate dust for months, and the understanding that most people who went west were fleeing failure or poverty in the East, not seeking adventure. Before we begin, leave me a comment telling me where you're listening from. And if there's another historical topic you'd like me to explore, let me know. Your suggestions shape these journeys. Now, let's ride into Texas and discover what daily life was really like when survival meant constant struggle against climate, economics, and human violence. Your life in Wild West Texas was fundamentally shaped by the climate, which was harsh in ways that defy romantic imagination. If you settled in West Texas, you encountered a semi-arid landscape where summer temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, where drought could last for years, where water was scarce and precious, and where the land seemed designed to punish human habitation. The vegetation was mesquite, cactus, and tough grasses, nothing that suggested agricultural abundance. The soil was often clay-like hardpan that was difficult to plow and didn't retain moisture well. If you were trying to establish a farm or ranch, you quickly learned that success depended entirely on access to water. Rivers and creeks were lifelines, and control of water sources meant control of vast surrounding territories. Ranchers claimed land along streams and effectively controlled everything within riding distance because, without water, land was worthless for grazing. This created conflicts over water rights that sometimes escalated to violence. If someone diverted a stream or built a dam upstream from your property, your livelihood was threatened, and law enforcement was too distant or too weak to resolve disputes peacefully. The cattle that made Texas ranching famous were Texas Longhorns, descendants of Spanish cattle that had gone feral and adapted to harsh conditions. These were not the docile cattle of modern feedlots, but semi-wild animals with horns spanning up to 7 feet, capable of running fast and fighting fiercely. They could survive on sparse vegetation and go days without water, making them suited to Texas environment. But they were difficult and dangerous to work with. Cowboys were frequently injured by cattle. Horns could gore you, stampeding herds could trample you, and even routine work like branding involved risk of being kicked or crushed. If you were a cowboy, and most were young men in their teens or 20s, your life was defined by physical hardship and monotony punctuated by moments of danger. The romantic image of the cowboy as independent frontier hero obscures the reality that cowboys were poorly paid laborers doing dangerous, dirty work for ranchers who owned the cattle and land. You earned perhaps $30–40 per month, about $1 a day, for work that lasted from before dawn after dusk. 7 days a week. There were no days off, no benefits, no job security. If you were injured and couldn't work, you were fired and left to fend for yourself. The daily work of cowboying involved endless riding to check on cattle spread across vast ranges, repairing fences when fences existed, much of the range was open, doctoring sick animals, searching for strays, and the seasonal work of roundups and cattle drives. You spent most of your time alone or with one or two other cowboys, riding through landscape that was beautiful in harsh way but also monotonous. The work was physically exhausting. You were in the saddle for 12, 14 hours daily, your body aching from the constant motion, your skin burned by sun and wind, your eyes perpetually squinting against glare and dust. The cattle drives that took herds from Texas to railheads in Kansas, the famous trails like the Chisholm Trail, were 3 to 4 month ordeals that tested endurance. You were part of a crew of perhaps 10 to 15 cowboys moving 2,000 to 3,000 cattle north across hundreds of miles of often hostile territory. Your day began around 4 a.m. when you were woken for your shift watching the herd. After a quick breakfast of beans, bacon, and coffee so strong it could dissolve a horseshoe, you worked until noon, ate more beans and bacon, worked until evening, ate more beans and bacon, then took your turn on night watch, sitting on your horse in darkness, circling the herd, singing to keep cattle calm. The singing that cowboys did wasn't artistic performance but practical necessity. Cattle were nervous creatures prone to stampeding at loud noises or disturbances. Soft singing or humming helped keep them calm and also let other cowboys know where you were in the darkness. The songs were simple, repetitive, often improvised, anything to make continuous sound without being loud enough to startle cattle. If stampedes started, you were supposed to ride alongside the running herd and try to turn them into circle so they'd tire themselves out. This was extraordinarily dangerous, riding at full gallop in darkness over rough terrain. With thousands of panicked animals running, you could be thrown, trampled, or your horse could step in a hole and break legs, sending you both down. The food on cattle drives was monotonous to the point of malnutrition. Beans, bacon, coffee, hardtack biscuits, and occasionally fresh meat, if cattle were slaughtered for food. No fresh vegetables or fruits, you developed scurvy symptoms if the drive lasted long enough. The cook prepared meals in a chuck wagon, a special wagon carrying food and cooking equipment, and his skill, or lack thereof, at making beans and bacon somewhat palatable determined morale. A good trail cook was valued nearly as much as a good trail boss, because keeping cowboys fed and reasonably content was essential to completing the drive. The dust was perhaps the worst aspect of cattle drives. You spent all day riding behind thousands of cattle churning up dust from dry soil. If you weren't the trail boss or the point riders at front of herd, you rode in thick clouds of dust that got into your eyes, nose, mouth, lungs, and ears. You breathed dust, ate dust, slept with dust, ground into your clothes and skin. Cowboys developed chronic coughs and lung problems from inhaling dust for months. You tied bandana over your face, but it provided minimal protection. By the end of the day, you were coated in layers of dust and sweat, and there was rarely opportunity to wash properly. Water during cattle drives was precious and often scarce. You crossed rivers when possible, but much of the trail was between water sources. You rationed water carefully, and when you found water, it was often muddy, alkaline, or contaminated by cattle. Dysentery was a common result of drinking bad water. debilitating illness where you suffered diarrhea, dehydration, and cramps while still being expected to work. There was no sick leave on cattle drive. You either kept working or you were left behind at next town, unpaid and on your own. The river crossings during cattle drives were particularly dangerous. Getting 2,000-plus cattle across a river required pushing them into water and hoping they'd swim across, rather than turning back or drowning. Cattle weren't strong swimmers and could panic in current. Cowboys had to enter the water with cattle, risking being swept away, kicked, or crushed between swimming animals. Men drowned during river crossings regularly. Their deaths were noted briefly in trail records, and life went on. The cattle still needed to reach Kansas. The towns at the end of cattle trails, Abilene, Dodge City, Wichita, were not the orderly communities of Western movies, but chaotic, violent places that existed primarily to extract money from cowboys who had been paid after delivering cattle. These were boom towns built quickly from rough lumber, featuring saloons, gambling halls, brothels, and very little else. The business model was simple: separate cowboys from their wages as quickly as possible through alcohol, gambling, and prostitution. After months on the trail, many cowboys were eager to spend their money, and town businesses were efficient at facilitating this. The violence in these cattle towns was real, but not the romanticized gunfighter duels of Hollywood. Most violence was drunken brawls, shootings over gambling disputes, or simply casual murder because someone was armed and angry and nobody stopped them. Law enforcement existed, but was often corrupt or simply outnumbered. Town marshals like Wyatt Earp were not heroic lawmen, but enforcers who worked for town business interests, keeping violence manageable enough not to drive away business, but not so controlled that it prevented money from flowing. Earp himself was involved in various dubious enterprises and probably killed more people than he arrested. The gunfighters who became legendary, Wild Bill Hickok, John Wesley Hardin, Billy the Kid, were not noble warriors, but mostly unstable men who killed people. Hickok was skilled gunfighter, but also gambler and sometime lawman who shot people in ambush as often as in fair fights. Hardin was psychopath who killed perhaps 40 people, many for trivial reasons. Billy the Kid was young criminal who killed several people during his short life and was himself killed at age 21. The code of the West about fair fights and honor was largely myth. Most killings were ambushes, back shootings, or simply overwhelming force against outgunned opponents. The weapons that made this violence possible were increasingly available thanks to industrial production. The Colt single-action Army revolver, the famous Peacemaker, became standard sidearm after its introduction in 1873. Winchester repeating rifles gave individuals firepower that earlier generations couldn't have imagined. These weapons were reliable, relatively affordable, and deadly. The combination of widely available guns, alcohol, economic desperation, and weak law enforcement created an environment where disputes escalated to lethal violence with disturbing frequency. If you were a woman in Wild West Texas, your options were severely limited and your life was often harder than men's. Respectable women, those who were married or daughters of property owners, were expected to maintain Eastern standards of domesticity in an environment that made this nearly impossible. You were supposed to keep house, raise children, maintain moral standards, and support your husband's enterprises while dealing with inadequate housing, scarce water, isolation from other women, and constant threat of violence or catastrophe. The domestic labor required in frontier conditions was exhausting. Water had to be hauled from well or creek, perhaps hundreds of yards from your house. Cooking was done over wood stove in house that became unbearably hot in Texas summer. You made your own clothes, growing and processing cotton or purchasing expensive fabric and sewing everything by hand. You preserved food, smoking meat, canning vegetables when jars were available, drying fruit. You raised chickens, tended garden in soil that resisted cultivation, and managed household economy on extremely limited resources. Childbirth in frontier Texas was dangerous experience without medical care. You gave birth attended by other women, neighbors, relatives, or sometimes just your husband, who had practical experience but no medical training. Complications could kill you, and there was little anyone could do. Infant mortality was staggering. Perhaps 30–40% of children died before age 5 from disease, accidents, or simple inability to thrive in harsh conditions. You might bear 8 children and raise 3 to adulthood. The emotional toll of repeated pregnancies and child deaths was immense but rarely discussed. You were expected to be stoic and faithful. The isolation was psychologically devastating for many women. Frontier ranches were often miles from nearest neighbors. You might go weeks without seeing another woman. Your social life was limited to infrequent visits to town for supplies or attendance at church, if one existed nearby. The loneliness, combined with unrelenting work and fear of violence, Native American raids, or natural disasters, drove some women to mental breakdown. Prairie madness was termed for psychological collapse that sometimes resulted from frontier isolation. Some women found different paths. The prostitutes in saloons and brothels of frontier towns. This wasn't choice most women made willingly, but rather result of desperation, coercion, or limited alternatives. Prostitution was dangerous, degrading work that exposed you to disease, violence, and social stigma that made any other life nearly impossible. The romanticization of soiled doves in Western mythology obscures that most prostitutes were exploited women trying to survive an economy that offered them few options. Disease was rampant, syphilis, gonorrhea, with no effective treatment. Violence from customers or pimps was common. Life expectancy was short. The Native American presence in Texas was declining violently during the Wild West period. The Comanche, Apache, Kiowa, and other tribes who had inhabited the region for centuries were being systematically displaced and destroyed through military campaigns, broken treaties, and destruction of buffalo herds that sustained their way of life. If you were settler, you were participating in this displacement, whether you acknowledged it or not. The land you claimed was taken from people who had lived there for generations and were being killed or forced onto reservations to make room for your cattle and farms. The raids that Native Americans conducted against settlers were responses to this displacement and ongoing violence against them. The Indian raids that terrified frontier communities were not unprovoked savagery, but warfare by people defending their land and way of life against invaders. This doesn't make the raids less terrifying for victims. Being raided, having family members killed or captured, losing livestock and property was traumatic regardless of historical context. But the framing of Native Americans as simply violent obstacles to progress obscures that they were being systematically exterminated to clear land for settlement. The Buffalo Soldiers, African American cavalry regiments, were ironically tasked with fighting Native Americans to secure land for white settlers who wouldn't have welcomed the soldiers themselves as neighbors. These black soldiers, many of them freed slaves or their sons, performed the violent work of displacement while themselves experiencing racism and discrimination. It was complicated history where victims of one oppression enforced another oppression, motivated by military duty, wages, and perhaps hope that military service would earn them respect and rights that America otherwise denied them. The ranching economy that drove Texas settlement was boom and bust cycle that enriched few and impoverished many. The cattle boom of 1870s was driven by simple economics. Texas had millions of cattle descended from Spanish stock, worth perhaps $3 per head in Texas, but worth $30, $40 in northern markets where beef demand was high. The difference minus the cost of driving cattle north represented profit that attracted investors and entrepreneurs. Successful cattle drives could make fortunes, but many drives failed. Cattle died of disease or drought, stampedes scattered herds, markets crashed, or drovers were cheated by buyers. The open range that allowed ranching to expand was also its downfall. Without fenced property rights, anyone could graze cattle anywhere, leading to overgrazing. The tragedy of the commons played out on Texas plains as too many cattle grazed land that couldn't support them. The harsh winter of 1886-87, the Great Die-Up, killed hundreds of thousands of cattle across the West as overgrazed ranges couldn't sustain herds through unusually severe conditions. Many ranchers who had seemed wealthy one year were bankrupt the next. The introduction of barbed wire in the 1870s transformed ranching and created new conflicts. Barbed wire allowed ranchers to fence large areas cheaply, establishing property boundaries and controlling access to water. This ended the open range but created violent disputes. Fence-cutting wars erupted as cowboys and small ranchers who depended on open range cut fences put up by large landowners. Some fence cutters were prosecuted, others were shot by angry property owners, and the conflicts escalated until Texas Rangers were deployed to restore order. The Texas Rangers themselves were not the heroic lawmen of legend, but paramilitary force that often operated more as private militia for wealthy landowners than as impartial peace officers. Rangers fought Native Americans, pursued bandits, both Mexican and Anglo, broke up labor disputes, and enforced property rights of the powerful. Their methods included summary execution, torture of suspects, and collective punishment of Mexican communities suspected of harboring outlaws. They were effective at imposing order, but the order they imposed often favored existing power structures. The Mexican population of Texas, Tejanos who had lived there before Texas independence from Mexico, occupied complicated position. They were legally citizens but often treated as second class or worse. Mexican vaqueros, cowboys, had developed the skills and techniques that Anglo cowboys adopted, but they were paid less and given less respect. Mexican landowners who held Spanish land grants often lost their property through legal manipulation, violence, or inability to prove title in Anglo court system. The casual racism toward Mexicans and Mexican Americans was pervasive and justified through claims of inherent inferiority. The legal system in frontier Texas was rough justice at best and lynch mob at worst. County sheriffs were often elected based on personal popularity rather than law enforcement ability. Judges rode circuit, appearing in towns infrequently. Jails were ramshackle structures that couldn't securely hold prisoners. The result was that serious crimes often resulted in summary execution by vigilante groups or committees of vigilance that claimed to be enforcing law but were really mobs. If you were accused of cattle rustling or murder, you might be tried by vigilantes and hanged from nearest tree, with minimal effort to determine if you were actually guilty. Disease was constant threat that killed more people than violence. Cholera epidemics swept through towns periodically, spread by contaminated water. Typhoid, dysentery, and various fevers killed people who didn't understand germ theory and had no effective treatments. Tuberculosis, consumption, was death sentence that you might live with for years, slowly wasting away. Snake bites from rattlesnakes were common and often fatal without antivenom. Simple infections from wounds could turn septic and kill you. Childbirth fever killed countless women. The absence of modern medicine meant that many conditions we consider minor today were potentially fatal. The medical care available in Wild West Texas was primitive and often ineffective or actively harmful. Frontier doctors had minimal training. Many had apprenticed with other doctors rather than attending medical school, and even medical school education was rudimentary by modern standards. Surgical procedures were performed without anesthesia or antiseptic technique. Amputations were common treatment for serious limb injuries. Bloodletting was still practiced based on ancient and incorrect theories about disease. Patent medicines, alcohol-based concoctions with opium or cocaine, were widely used and addictive, but rarely curative. If you were injured severely, trampled by cattle, shot, crushed in accident, your chances of survival depended largely on luck. A bullet wound to abdomen was almost always fatal. No surgeon could repair internal damage without killing you through shock or infection. Broken bones might heal crooked, leaving you with permanent limp or impaired use of limb. Burns from cooking fires or prairie fires could leave you disfigured and in chronic pain. Dental problems meant chronic toothaches and eventually loss of teeth with no effective pain relief. The alcoholism that was rampant in frontier towns wasn't just moral failing, but response to chronic pain, trauma, and difficult conditions. Alcohol was safe to drink when water was contaminated, provided calories and numbness, and was readily available. Whiskey was sometimes the only medicine available for pain. The result was widespread alcohol dependence that destroyed lives, families, and communities. Drunk men were more violent, more likely to gamble away wages, and more likely to die in accidents. But temperance movements hadn't yet gained political power to restrict alcohol availability. The economic reality of Wild West was that most people struggled financially. The cowboys working for wages were at bottom of economic ladder, barely scraping by. Small ranchers or farmers who owned property were slightly better off, but vulnerable to drought, market fluctuations, or simple bad luck. A few large ranchers and businessmen became wealthy, but they were exceptions. Most people who went west seeking fortune returned east poor or stayed west poor. The mythology of frontier opportunity obscures that economic mobility was limited and success often required exploitation of others or simply being in right place at right time. The railroad's expansion across Texas transformed the economy and society. Before railroads, cattle had to be driven north to Kansas railheads. After railroads reached Texas in the 1870s and 1880s, cattle could be shipped from Texas, making trail drives obsolete. This changed everything. Towns that depended on trail drive traffic declined or died. New towns sprang up along rail lines, and ranchers who had access to railroad shipping had advantages over those who didn't. The romantic era of the cowboy on the trail lasted perhaps 20 years before economic changes made it largely unnecessary. The railroads also brought development that ended the frontier. Towns grew along rail lines. Telegraph lines followed railroads, connecting Texas to national communications networks. Eastern capital flowed west to invest in ranches, businesses, and land speculation. The isolation that had characterized frontier gradually disappeared as Texas became integrated into national economy and society. This brought benefits: easier access to goods, better communication, stronger legal institutions, but it also ended the distinctiveness of frontier life. The farmers who came to Texas looking for land discovered that much of the state was better suited to ranching than farming. The semi-arid conditions, unreliable rainfall, and tough soil made agriculture difficult. You could dry farm wheat or cotton in some areas, but yields were unpredictable and droughts could destroy entire crops. Irrigation was possible near rivers, but expensive to establish and maintain. The homesteaders who claimed land under Homestead Act often found that 160 acres wasn't enough to support a family through farming in Texas conditions. The conflicts between the farmers and ranchers shaped Texas development. Farmers wanted to fence property to keep cattle out of crops. Ranchers wanted open range for cattle to graze. Farmers needed access to water sources that ranchers controlled. Ranchers saw farmers as interlopers on land better used for grazing. These conflicts were sometimes settled peacefully through negotiation, sometimes through court battles, and sometimes through violence. The fence-cutting wars mentioned earlier were manifestation of these fundamental disagreements about land use. The cotton farming that became important in East Texas was different from ranching both economically and socially. Cotton required intensive labor during planting and especially harvest. This labor was often provided by sharecroppers, both white and black, who worked land they didn't own in exchange for share of crop. Sharecropping was a system that kept farmers in perpetual debt to landowners and merchants who provided seed, tools, and supplies on credit. It was economic trap that resembled slavery in many respects, particularly for black sharecroppers who faced additional barriers of racism. The experience of black Texans during Wild West period was shaped by recent emancipation from slavery and the violent backlash of Reconstruction's end. Freedmen tried to establish farms, businesses, and communities while facing systematic discrimination, violence, and economic exploitation. Some black cowboys worked alongside white cowboys, finding that on cattle drives racial barriers were somewhat reduced by shared hardship. But this relative equality on the trail didn't extend to towns or broader society. Lynchings of black men were common, often on flimsiest pretexts, and perpetrators were rarely prosecuted. The Native American perspective on Wild West Texas was of catastrophic destruction. The Comanche, who had dominated the plains for over a century, were militarily defeated and forced onto reservations by late 1870s. The last major Indian war in Texas was the Red River War of 1874-75, which ended with Comanche surrender. The buffalo that Comanche depended on were hunted nearly to extinction by white hunters who killed millions for hides, leaving carcasses to rot on the plains. This was deliberate policy to destroy Native American subsistence base and force them onto reservations. The reservations where Native Americans were confined were poorly managed, underfunded, and often corrupt. Rations promised by treaty were inadequate or didn't arrive. Indian agents stole supplies meant for reservation residents. Traditional ways of life were suppressed. Children were taken to boarding schools to be civilized. Religious practices were banned. Movement off reservations was restricted. It was cultural genocide, accompanying the physical displacement and killing. By 1890, the Indian problem was considered solved, not through justice, but through overwhelming force and systemic destruction. The mythology of the Wild West began developing even as the actual frontier was disappearing. Dime novels, cheap adventure stories, romanticized cowboys, gunfighters, and frontier life for Eastern audiences. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, starting in 1883, dramatized frontier scenes including mock battles between cowboys and Indians, cattle drives, and sharpshooting demonstrations. These were entertainment that took real elements of frontier life and transformed them into theater, exaggerating violence, romanticizing characters, and ignoring the exploitation, racism, and economic reality that characterized actual West. The closing of the frontier, declared by the U.S. Census in 1890, when population density reached level where continuous frontier line no longer existed, marked symbolic end of Wild West era. But the mythology was just beginning. As actual frontier disappeared, nostalgia for it grew. The rough, violent, difficult reality was reframed as heroic age of American independence and courage. The people who had lived through it, the aging cowboys, ranchers, lawmen, found themselves celebrated as heroes of vanished era. Some embraced this role, writing memoirs or appearing in Wild West shows. Others found the mythology irritating distortion of what they'd actually experienced. The reality was that frontier Texas was a place of economic opportunity for some, primarily those who already had capital or who were willing to exploit others. For most people, it was a place of hard work, constant danger, inadequate food and shelter, disease, and early death. The independence that frontier supposedly offered was mostly myth. You were dependent on markets you couldn't control, weather you couldn't predict, and social structures that limited opportunities based on race, gender, and class. The freedom was freedom to struggle and possibly fail. The environmental damage done during Wild West period has lasting consequences. Overgrazing by cattle degraded prairie ecosystems. Buffalo were hunted to near extinction. Predators like wolves and bears were systematically exterminated. The mesquite that is now characteristic of much of Texas landscape expanded due to overgrazing and fire suppression. Water sources were diverted and depleted. Soil erosion from plowing marginal land created problems that persist today. The settlement of Texas was also an ecological catastrophe whose effects are still being felt. The violence that characterized Wild West Texas against Native Americans between competing economic interests, casual murders, and lynchings was eventually suppressed as stronger state institutions developed. But suppression didn't mean justice. Many crimes went unpunished. Many perpetrators of violence against Native Americans, Mexicans, and Black Texans were never held accountable. The order that replaced frontier chaos was order that reflected and enforced existing racial and economic hierarchies. The Wild West's end didn't bring justice, but rather more efficient and institutionalized forms of oppression. The cowboy as cultural symbol became disconnected from cowboy as actual laborer. The real cowboys, poorly paid wage workers doing dangerous, dirty work were transformed into symbols of American masculinity, independence, and freedom. This transformation erased the actual experience of most cowboys, who were Mexican American or black, who had little independence and whose freedom was constrained by economic necessity. The mythological cowboy serves contemporary ideological purposes that have nothing to do with historical reality. The women of the Wild West who maintained households, raised children, and endured isolation and hardship disappeared from popular mythology until relatively recently. When women appeared in Western stories, they were either prostitutes or school teachers, dramatic roles that suited narrative purposes. The actual experience of most frontier women, endless domestic labor, childbearing that often killed them, emotional isolation, and lack of options, wasn't romantic enough for mythology. Frontier life for women was often trap from which there was no escape except death. The daily routine in frontier Texas varied by occupation, but shared common elements of exhausting physical labor and inadequate comfort. If you were rancher, your day began before dawn checking on livestock, repairing equipment and buildings, managing hired hands, and dealing with 100 small crises that arose. If you were a farmer, you plowed, planted, weeded, and harvested by hand with minimal mechanical assistance. If you were merchant in frontier town, you maintained store while dealing with limited supply, unreliable transportation, and customers who might pay with livestock instead of cash. The housing that most Texans lived in during Wild West period was rough and inadequate. Dugouts, homes carved into hillsides with a roof of logs and sod, were common in treeless areas. Sod houses built with blocks of prairie grass and roots provided better insulation, but were dark, prone to leaks, and sometimes collapsed. Log cabins were better, but required timber that wasn't available everywhere. Later, frame houses built with milled lumber were improvement, but expensive and rare. Most people lived in 1 or 2 rooms with dirt floors, minimal furniture, no running water, and no protection from heat or cold beyond what structure provided. The clothing worn in Wild West Texas was practical but uncomfortable. Cotton and wool garments were worn in layers that could be added or removed as temperature changed dramatically throughout day. Leather was used for boots, chaps to protect legs while riding, and vests. All clothing was expensive relative to wages. A cowboy's outfit might cost a month's wages and had to last for years. You owned few clothes and wore them until they were patched beyond repair. Bathing and laundry were infrequent due to water scarcity and effort required, so everyone smelled of sweat, smoke, horses, and cattle. The entertainment in frontier Texas was limited and often rough. Saloons provided alcohol, gambling, and sometimes music. Dances were social events that brought scattered population together, though these could turn violent when men competed for attention of scarce women. Horse racing and rodeo-type competitions developed from work skills. Bronc riding, roping, turned into contests. Storytelling around campfires or in saloons was entertainment and way of transmitting news and local lore. Books and newspapers were scarce and expensive. For most people, entertainment was rare break from constant work. The religion that shaped many frontier communities was predominantly Protestant, Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, with Catholic presence particularly in areas near Mexico and in German settlements. Circuit riding preachers traveled between small settlements, holding services when they arrived. Churches were often first community buildings constructed in new towns. Religion provided moral framework, social cohesion, and hope for better life after death, if earthly life was harsh. But religious communities also enforced conservative social norms and ostracized those who didn't conform. The specific towns that embodied Wild West Texas each had character shaped by their economic function and the people who populated them. Fort Worth began as Army post in 1849 and became major cattle shipping point with railroad arrival in 1876. Abilene, Texas version, not the famous Kansas town, was established as railroad stop and quickly attracted saloons and businesses serving cattle trade. Dodge City, again, Kansas example but illustrative, processed thousands of cattle and developed reputation for violence that eventually prompted business leaders to hire lawmen to impose order, not because they opposed violence morally, but because excessive violence was bad for business. The economic details of cattle operations reveal how wealth was created and concentrated. A rancher who started with modest herd and good grazing land could expand rapidly during boom years. Calves were essentially free, born from existing stock, and grew to market weight on free or cheap grass from public lands. Labor costs were minimal, a few cowboys at $1 per day. The main costs were maintaining breeding stock through winter and the risk of losses to disease, drought, or theft. Successful ranchers accumulated capital and bought more land, while unsuccessful ones lost everything and became wage laborers or left Texas. The banking and credit systems that developed to finance cattle operations were often predatory. Merchants extended credit at high interest rates to cowboys and small ranchers who needed supplies but lacked cash. When drought or market crash prevented repayment, creditors foreclosed on property or confiscated cattle. The larger operators who had diverse assets and access to eastern capital could weather bad years that bankrupted smaller operators. It was economic system that concentrated wealth upward and left most participants vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The specific legal cases that made their way through frontier courts revealed the tensions and conflicts of the era. Disputes over water rights could drag on for years as ranchers, farmers, and towns competed for limited water. Fence-cutting cases pitted open-range advocates against private property rights. Murder cases often hinged on whether killing was self-defense, broadly defined in frontier justice, or murder, narrowly defined. The legal proceedings were often farcical by modern standards. Witnesses were intimidated or bribed, juries reflected local prejudices, and judges were sometimes drunk or corrupt. The individual stories that emerge from historical records add texture to statistical
There was
picture.
Charles
Goodnight, who established Goodnight Loving Trail and became successful rancher through skill and ruthlessness, ultimately dying wealthy in 1929, having lived through complete transformation from frontier to modern Texas. There was Cathay Williams, black woman who disguised herself as man to join Buffalo Soldiers, served for 2 years before being discharged when her sex was discovered, showing both the possibility of crossing rigid boundaries and the limitations when discovered. There was Gregorio Cortez, Mexican-American, who in 1901 killed 2 sheriffs in self-defense during incident resulting from translation error. The Spanish word for mare was mistranslated as male horse, leading officers to believe Cortez had stolen horse. Cortez evaded massive manhunt for 10 days before being captured. His case became cause célèbre in Mexican-American community and raised questions about language barriers and justice. He was eventually pardoned, but his story shows how cultural misunderstandings could turn deadly in an environment of prejudice and quick violence. There was Laura Bullion, member of Butch Cassidy's Wild Bunch gang, one of few women outlaws documented in historical record. She participated in train robberies alongside male gang members and was eventually captured and imprisoned. After release, she apparently lived quiet life under different name, dying in 1961. Another person who lived through complete transformation from Wild West to modern America. Her story complicates narrative about women's roles. Most women were constrained by domesticity, but some few found ways, however criminal, to act outside prescribed roles. The Texas Rangers during Wild West period included figures who were both effective lawmen and participants in ethnic violence. Leander McNelly and his Rangers fought Mexican bandits along border, but also killed Mexican civilians in retaliatory raids. The Rangers were effective at suppressing violence and establishing order, but the order they established was one that privileged Anglo property owners and systematically disadvantaged Mexican Americans. Their legacy is complicated. Genuine service mixed with documented human rights violations that were never adequately addressed. The drought cycles that periodically devastated Texas ranching followed patterns that weren't understood at the time. The Great Plains experiences multi-year drought cycles driven by ocean temperature patterns and other climatological factors. During wet years, ranchers expanded herds and settlement pushed into marginal lands. When inevitable drought returned, overstocked ranges couldn't support cattle and settlement in marginal areas failed. This boom-bust cycle repeated throughout Wild West period and continues in modified form today. The settlers weren't foolish. They were responding rationally to information available, but they lacked understanding of longer climate patterns. The technology that gradually transformed ranching included windmills that allowed access to underground water away from streams, improved barbed wire designs that made fencing more effective and cheaper, refrigerated rail cars that allowed beef to be shipped long distances, and eventually automobiles and trucks that replaced horses. Each technological change transformed operations and created winners and losers. Ranchers who adopted new technologies and had capital to invest prospered. Those who couldn't adapt or afford investments struggled. The Wild West shows that Buffalo Bill Cody and others operated from 1880s through early 1900s, employed real cowboys, Indians, and frontier figures to perform for audiences in America and Europe. These shows created and spread mythology, while also providing employment for people whose frontier skills were becoming obsolete. Native Americans who performed in Wild West shows were complicated figures. On one hand, they needed income, and shows provided it. On the other hand, they were performing for audiences who wanted to see savage Indians defeated by civilized cowboys, essentially reenacting their own dispossession as entertainment. The dime novels that romanticized Wild West were published by the millions and read avidly by working-class Americans who found escape in stories of frontier adventure. Authors like Ned Buntline created legendary characters, often based loosely on real people like Buffalo Bill or Wild Bill Hickok, and put them in outrageous adventures that had little connection to reality. These novels shaped public perception of West and created expectations that real West couldn't meet. People who went West expecting adventure from dime novels often found instead harsh labor and disappointment. The photography that documented Wild West was limited by technology, but still produced invaluable historical record. Photos of cattle drives, town scenes, and frontier people show details that written descriptions miss. But photography also shaped mythology. Photographers staged dramatic scenes, and people posed for photographs in ways that projected desired image rather than daily reality. The famous photo of Jesse James's gang, for example, shows them dressed formally and posed heroically, not at all like actual appearance of men living rough criminal lives. The newspapers that served frontier communities were often partisan political organs as much as news sources. Editors advocated for particular factions or interests, and news was shaped by editorial biases. Accounts of violence, conflicts with Native Americans, and business dealings need to be read critically because reporters had their own agendas. Still, these newspapers provide invaluable primary sources for understanding how frontier Texans saw themselves and their world, even when accounts are biased or incomplete. The legacy of Wild West Texas to modern Texas identity is powerful but selective. Modern Texans embrace cowboy imagery and frontier heritage, while often forgetting or minimizing the violence, racism, and exploitation that characterized the era. The Texas mystique of independence and individualism draws on Wild West mythology, but ignores that frontier settlers depended heavily on federal government, land grants, military protection, railroad subsidies, and that independence was mostly available to white men with property. Still, the mythology shapes Texas culture, politics, and self-image in ways that affect contemporary society. The guns that defined Wild West culture were tools as much as weapons. You needed rifle to hunt game for food, to protect livestock from predators, and possibly to defend yourself from human threats. Handguns were less necessary for daily life, but became symbols of masculine power and independence. The Colt revolver and Winchester rifle were mechanical achievements, reliable, relatively accurate, and mass-produced at prices that made them widely available. This democratization of firepower had profound consequences for frontier society, where disputes were often settled by whoever could shoot faster or more accurately. The famous gunfights that movies dramatize, two men facing each other on dusty street, hands poised over pistols, drawing and firing in split second, rarely happened in reality. Most killings were ambushes, drunken shootings at close range, or simply someone shot in the back. The quick draw was largely Hollywood invention. Real gunfighters who survived did so by being willing to kill and by avoiding fair fights. They shot from cover, shot first, or overwhelmed opponents with superior numbers or firepower. The mythology of honorable gunfighter duel serves narrative purposes but has little basis in historical record. The specific incidents that became legendary often had complex backstories that mythology simplified. The gunfight at OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, not Texas but iconic of Wild West, involved long-standing conflicts between the Earp brothers, who were involved in various legal and illegal enterprises, and the Clanton-McClory faction, who were cattle rustlers and also political rivals. The actual gunfight lasted about 30 seconds, resulted in 3 deaths, and was followed by vendetta killings and legal proceedings. It wasn't a simple story of good lawmen against bad outlaws, but complex conflict between competing criminal factions. The outlaws who became famous, Jesse James, the Dalton Gang, Sam Bass, were not Robin Hood figures, but criminals who robbed banks and trains, sometimes killed people, and eventually were killed or captured. Their elevation to folk heroes reflects American ambivalence about authority and sympathy for underdogs, even criminal underdogs. But for victims, bank clerks who were shot, passengers who were terrorized, communities that lost money to robberies, these outlaws were simply violent criminals who made life more dangerous. The transition from Wild West to modern Texas happened gradually between 1890 and 1920. Barbed wire fenced the open range. Railroads connected previously isolated communities. Oil discoveries, Spindletop in 1901 being most famous, transformed Texas' economy from agriculture-based to industrial. Towns became cities. Law enforcement became more professional. Education became more widespread. The frontier rough and tumble gave way to more settled society with all the benefits and constraints of civilization. The people who lived through Wild West period and survived into 20th century found themselves in a world radically different from the one they'd known in youth. Cowboys who had driven cattle to Kansas in 1870s saw automobiles, airplanes, and movies in their old age. Women who had given birth in sod houses lived to see their grandchildren grow up in modern towns with electricity and running water. The pace of change was disorienting, and many felt that something valuable, however harsh, had been lost in the transformation. The nostalgia for Wild West that developed in early 20th century was partly reaction to modernization. As America industrialized and urbanized, the frontier came to represent freedom from constraints of industrial capitalism. Even though frontier had its own harsh constraints that nostalgia conveniently forgot, the cowboy became symbol of rugged individualism, even though real cowboys were wage laborers with little independence. The Wild West became mythical past when men were men and life was simple, even though life was actually complicated, difficult, and short for most people. The Wild West shows, dime novels, and eventually movies that created enduring mythology served entertainment purposes, but also ideological ones. They promoted narrative of American destiny, that settling the West was inevitable and righteous, that violence against Native Americans was justified, that economic inequality was natural result of individual merit, that racial hierarchies were appropriate. These stories weren't innocent entertainment, but cultural products that reinforced beliefs that served powerful interests. The modern reenactment communities and Western heritage enthusiasts who celebrate cowboy culture often focus on aesthetics, clothing, equipment, skills like roping or shooting, while avoiding the harder realities of racism, environmental destruction, economic exploitation, and violence that characterized actual Wild West. This selective memory creates sanitized version of history that's comfortable to celebrate but fundamentally dishonest about what actually happened. The lesson from Wild West Texas isn't that frontier life was romantic adventure, but that survival in difficult environment requires adaptation and often involves exploitation and violence. The people who succeeded weren't necessarily most virtuous or hardworking, but those who were lucky, ruthless, or both. The mythology that celebrates individual success ignores structural factors that determined outcomes and the human costs of progress. Understanding Wild West honestly means acknowledging both the courage of people who endured difficult conditions and the injustices they participated in or benefited from. For the individual living in Wild West Texas, whose name we'll likely never know, whose specific struggles are lost to history, life meant waking up and facing another day of hard work with minimal reward, constant danger from environment and people, and uncertainty about whether you'd survive another year. Your concerns were immediate and practical: where next meal came from, whether cattle would survive drought, if wound would become infected, whether raiders would attack. You didn't think about your place in grand narrative of American expansion. You thought about survival. You had same capacity for love, hope, fear, and suffering as people in any era. You loved your family even if you rarely expressed it in words. You hoped for better future even when present was hard. You feared death, disease, violence, and failure. You found small pleasures: a good meal, a joke with friends, a child's laughter, the beauty of sunset over plains, within life that was difficult and often brutal. You were fully human, navigating circumstances beyond your control, making choices with limited information and options. The cattle drives, gunfights, boom towns, and range wars that define Wild West mythology were real events, but they were exceptional moments in lives mostly defined by routine labor and small struggles. The romance that later generations projected onto this period had little to do with lived experience of most people who were there. They weren't heroes or villains of grand drama, but ordinary people trying to survive and perhaps prosper in challenging environment where the deck was stacked against most of them. So the next time you encounter Wild West imagery in movies, books, or tourist attractions, the heroic cowboys, the noble lawmen, the exciting gunfights, the frontier freedom, remember the cowboy eating dust behind 2,000 cattle for months, the woman dying in childbirth without medical care, the Native American watching their world destroyed, the Mexican American losing land to Anglo-legal manipulation, the black freedman lynched for imagined offense. Remember that most people who went west didn't find fortune or adventure but struggled to survive, and many died young from disease, violence, or accidents. Life in Wild West Texas wasn't adventure but endurance test. The courage wasn't in seeking glory, but in facing each day's difficulties without giving up. The achievement wasn't conquering wilderness, but surviving another year in an environment that killed regularly and indifferently. The freedom was mostly myth. You were constrained by economics, social hierarchies, and your own mortality in ways that made actual freedom elusive for all but the most privileged. The Wild West ended not because frontier spirit died, but because economic and technological changes made frontier obsolete. Railroads, barbed wire, corporate ranching, and stronger state institutions transformed Texas from frontier to settled society. The process was neither smooth nor fair. Benefits went disproportionately to those who already had power, while costs were borne by those with least power. The mythology that emerged celebrated winners and ignored losers, romanticized violence and ignored suffering, and created narrative of progress that obscured what was lost and who paid the price. And so ends our journey through Wild West Texas. If you enjoyed this exploration of reality behind the mythology, subscribe for more journeys revealing historical truths. Leave a comment telling me which aspect of Wild West life surprised you most, or suggest another historical topic you'd like me to explore. Sleep well, time traveler. and maybe tonight. Appreciate that you have medical care that can treat infections and ease pain, that you can acquire food without months of dangerous labor, that your survival doesn't depend on rainfall and market prices beyond your control, that you live under legal system that, however imperfect, is more just than vigilante violence, and that the ordinary struggles of your life probably don't include being shot over a dispute or dying from cholera. Appreciate that you can learn about the past honestly without romanticizing it, understand that human courage and human cruelty often coexist, and recognize that progress for some often comes at cost to others. Sweet dreams. End of script. The comparison between Wild West mythology and historical reality reveals how societies construct narratives about their pasts that serve present purposes. The Wild West myth emphasizes individual agency, righteous violence, and inevitable progress, narratives that justify present inequalities by suggesting they result from individual merit rather than structural advantages. The reality that most frontier settlers failed, that success often required exploitation or violence, and that progress for some meant destruction for others, doesn't fit comfortable narrative. Understanding Wild West honestly requires acknowledging both the genuine courage and resilience of people who endured difficult conditions and the systemic injustices that characterized the era. The environmental historian's perspective on Wild West reveals that period was ecological disaster as much as human drama. Prairie ecosystems that had developed over millennia were transformed in decades. Buffalo that had numbered in tens of millions were reduced to few hundred. Grasslands were overgrazed and eroded. Water sources were depleted. Predators were exterminated. The changes were so rapid and extensive that by time conservation movements developed in early 20th century, much damage was irreversible. The frontier wasn't wilderness tamed by human industry, but complex ecosystem destroyed by unsustainable exploitation. The archaeological evidence from Wild West period, abandoned homesteads, ghost towns, trash dumps, provides material record that complements and sometimes contradicts written sources. Artifacts show what people actually used and consumed, revealing details about daily life that documents miss. The remains of failed settlements show how many people tried and failed to establish viable communities. The grave markers in frontier cemeteries show mortality rates and causes of death. This physical evidence grounds historical understanding in material reality, rather than just textual accounts that may be biased or incomplete. The oral histories collected from last survivors of Wild West period in early to mid-20th century provide valuable first-hand accounts, though they must be read critically since memory is selective and people often reshape their stories to fit established narratives. Former cowboys describing their experiences decades later sometimes romanticized hardships in retrospect or emphasized dramatic incidents while downplaying routine labor. Still, these accounts capture voices and perspectives that wouldn't otherwise be preserved and provide human dimension to statistical and documentary records. The question of what we should learn from Wild West Texas is complicated. On one hand, the period shows human adaptability and capacity to survive in difficult conditions, valuable reminder of human resilience. On the other hand, it shows costs of rapid expansion driven by exploitation and violence, cautionary tale about unsustainable development. The appropriate lesson isn't simply that frontier spirit should be celebrated or condemned, but that complex historical phenomena require nuanced understanding that acknowledges both achievements and injustices, both courage and cruelty, both progress and destruction. For contemporary society grappling with questions about immigration, property rights, environmental protection, and social justice, Wild West history offers relevant parallels. The displacement of Native Americans and Mexicans parallels current debates about who belongs and who has rights to land and resources. The exploitation of labor parallels current concerns about worker rights and economic inequality. The environmental damage parallels current climate and conservation challenges. History doesn't repeat exactly, but patterns and dynamics recur in ways that make historical understanding relevant to present concerns. The ultimate question about Wild West Texas is whether the benefits of settlement and development outweighed costs. For European American settlers who succeeded, answer was clearly yes. They built farms and ranches, raised families, and created communities that evolved into modern Texas. For Native Americans who were displaced and nearly exterminated, answer was obviously no. They lost everything. For Mexican Americans who were dispossessed of land and relegated to second-class status, answer depends on whether opportunities created by Texas development offset systematic discrimination they faced. For the environment and species that were destroyed, there is no answer. They simply ceased to exist. The honest accounting of Wild West Texas requires acknowledging that period was characterized by both remarkable human achievement and profound human suffering and injustice. People who endured incredible hardships to build new lives demonstrated courage and resilience that deserves recognition. But their success often came at direct cost to others: Native Americans, Mexicans, the environment itself. The celebration of frontier achievement without acknowledgement of its costs is incomplete history that serves mythology rather than understanding. Real history requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, that people can be both courageous and complicit, that progress for some can mean destruction for others, that systems of exploitation can produce both wealth and suffering. The Wild West Texas wasn't preparation for modern Texas, but rather specific historical period with its own dynamics, challenges, and character that deserves understanding on its own terms. The mythologization that followed served various purposes: entertainment, inspiration, justification of American expansion, but obscured actual experience of people who lived through it. Understanding Wild West honestly means looking past mythology to find the human beings who struggled, survived, failed, and died in an environment that was harsh and often unjust, who made the best decisions they could with limited information and options, and whose lives mattered, even though most of them left no records and are forgotten by history.